Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today I'm covering Shuffleboarding and Professor Squidward, which for me are two episodes that teeter the line of forgettability, kind of just landing as some rarely discussed Season 6 episodes that fade into the ether. Something about this latter half of Season 6 has got forgettable written all over it. I feel like this is something that happens a lot with the second halves of seasons in the show. I'll have to look into that to see if that's a real trend or something I just made up. Well, anyway, all of this is besides the point, so let me just move on to the part where I say thank you, as always, to everyone who has chosen to tune into the video today, and with that, let's just get right into it. Starting things off today is Shuffleboarding, which is, as I said, another one of the more forgettable episodes of Season 6. Personally, I do generally remember this episode, like its plot and the characters involved, but considering I literally never see anyone talk about this episode despite it including Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, I feel pretty comfortable in my judgment of calling this a forgettable episode. Speaking of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, I'm honestly surprised at how quickly that we're seeing them again, and how quickly we're getting another Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode in general. Well, Ditchin only barely counts as one, but y'all know what I mean. If they appear in an episode, it counts for me. I liked this little bit in the beginning of this episode with the two heroes interacting with the narrator. I thought that was fun, and I'm also glad that this is one of those episodes where Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy know who SpongeBob and Patrick are, because I think it's more entertaining that way, especially if you imagine all the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes existing in one continuity, or however you want to parse that out. All of the slapstick with Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy was a bit unexpected, to be honest, because I wasn't quite thinking of having slapstick happening with clearly elderly characters. But I mean, it's SpongeBob SquarePants, so the slapstick isn't really visceral. Well, sometimes the slapstick in the show is visceral, but that's not a usual occurrence. Anyway, maybe the slapstick is why they actually ended up going to the hospital after all the shenanigans, and then the bit between SpongeBob and Patrick with the flowers was really cute. Soon enough, the plot of the episode gets to moving, with SpongeBob and Patrick taking the place of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy at the shuffleboarding competition. I love how they're just randomly certified Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy impersonators. They would be, wouldn't they? And of course, we know that SpongeBob and Patrick will do something unreasonable once Barnacle Boy reassures himself that they won't cause too much damage. Honestly, Barnacle Boy is a very funny character to me. I often say that Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are meh characters for me, and that's true, though I'm mostly talking about them as a duo, or really just Mermaid Man alone. Barnacle Boy is very dry and snarky, and I like that kind of humor, so he's actually pretty good when he gets the chance to throw in some of that snark. Anyway, the little outfits SpongeBob and Patrick wear as impersonators are cute. Shuffleboarding then pulls a little bit of a bait and switch on us because instead of, perhaps, showing the shuffleboarding tournament, SpongeBob and Patrick actually win the tournament off screen without any prompting. This means that this episode is not about shuffleboarding at all. I can't tell if it would have been more entertaining to show them actually shuffleboarding or not. Probably not, to be honest, because it probably would have turned out to be something similar to Krusty Crushers, which I didn't entirely enjoy, as you may recall, so the bait and switch here is accepted in my books. I guess now the episode is more like Ditchin' at this point. And then the episode becomes a critique of mass incarceration. Actually, I don't know how I'm supposed to save that one. I'm mostly joking anyway. Mostly. Honestly, this really just feels like a parody of the already exaggerated jokes about Batman. And what ends up happening is pretty funny, so that's good. The bit with Man Ray was nice as well. It's always fun to see him, and it's even more fun to see him not be explicitly evil. That reminds me, we haven't seen Plankton in a while, have we? Okay, well, anyway, the action scene in the laundromat was pretty fun, delightfully cheesy, I must say, and I like how the ending of that scene almost feels like a reference to SquarePants or Not to SquarePants. At least that's how it feels since I'm fresh from reviewing that episode. The ending of Shuffleboarding is pretty funny and also predictable, of course. Poor Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy forced to face the consequences of SpongeBob and Patrick's romp as cops, I mean superheroes, and the episode ends with an absolutely gorgeous background, so that is truly a win for me. Shuffleboarding starts out a bit slow, but in general, this episode is pretty enjoyable in my opinion, and this surprised me given how little people discuss this episode. It's truly a hidden gem. I liked how this episode really leaned into the cheesiness, like with the scene with Man Ray, and I also felt that the plot of the episode was simply fun as well. And while the episode was funny, it wasn't super funny or anything, but lately most of these episodes haven't been making me full-on belly laugh, so I'll take what I can get. All of this together is why this episode is being put in my great tier, where it comes in with a score of 8 out of 10. To the surprise of no one, Professor Squidward is yet another average and unremarkable episode from Season 6. Like Shuffleboarding, this is one of those episodes where I can still remember the basic plot and maybe a few jokes, but I also know that I never see anyone talk about this episode ever. Also, whenever I think of this episode now, I also think of the Season 13 episode Mandatory Music. I can't remember if I made this connection when reviewing that episode. I could open the SpongeBob Mania forum right now and check, but what would be the fun in that? It's nice to see an episode that follows a different character than SpongeBob, and we have been getting these a little bit this season. I think of House Fancy, Penny Foolish, Suction Cup Symphony, Plankton's Regular. Like, it's happened before, but I still like when it happens. And it's also nice, no, great, to see Squilliam again in this episode, especially knowing that I'm approaching the end of his episode appearances and fast. Squidward's turtleneck in this episode is also a great design choice. I love it, and I love when they change up the ways that characters look, especially when it's in subtle ways like this. The way that this entire plot revolves around the point of Squidward being mistaken for Squilliam raises some, questions from me. Like, is it that all octopuses look alike, or are the fish in Bikini Bottom just racist? I kid, obviously. But, I mean, the headmistress is exceedingly negligent to believe Squidward when he says that he's Squilliam after he's just had his whole loud-ass display of anger, not to mention asserting that he is Squidward Q Tentacles. Also, he doesn't even have the unibrow, but, well, the characters in this show aren't necessarily known for their common sense, and it is, of course, a very common trope to make characters exceedingly not observant in order for a plot to work. So... And this whole part of the episode is funny to me, so it really doesn't matter, especially once they start roasting Squidward. Once Squidward arrives to teach his class, from here, the episode kind of reminds me of Artist Unknown, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course. And also, no, I would not call Professor Squidward a ripoff of Artist Unknown. I've seen some people say that, and I disagree. I'll start with the actually relevant reason as to why I think that, and that is that the only similarity between this episode and Artist Unknown is Squidward teaching a class about something related to the arts. And also, I suppose you could say that SpongeBob being one of his students is also a similarity, but then that's really it. The more tangential reason I think this is that I usually avoid using the term ripoff when reviewing this show anyway. Like, how can you rip off yourself? And yes, usually it's different writers writing the episodes that people consider to be ripoffs, but y'all know what I mean. These episodes are all part of the show SpongeBob SquarePants. A show can't rip itself off, in my opinion. It can use similar plots, sure, but to call that ripping off doesn't really fit for me. Also, I just have really stringent criteria to consider something a ripoff. Like, there has to be a lot of similarities between episodes for me to even think about using that term. By the time I finished reviewing season 13 of this show in my written reviews, I believe I only ever unironically called an episode a ripoff once. And even then, that was like pulling teeth. But this was a tangent. Let me get back to the episode now. Squidward coming into the classroom with that ugly-ass wig is hilarious to me. Also, I didn't know this until I started watching some British crime dramas. Do I got any Broadchurch lovers in here? But apparently lawyers and judges in the UK wear those ugly wigs during trials. That's literally horrendous. Anyway, this beginning scene with the name writing is another example of awkward humor. It's of a different kind to the type that I abhor, but it is still based in awkwardness, with Billy being like, this guy is weird, and us as the audience being like, this interaction is weird. So while it doesn't really annoy me like the slow, not talking type of awkward humor, it still feels boring. Then SpongeBob and Patrick come in, and I gotta say, just SpongeBob's design here gives me a bad feeling, because it's that damn design that I can't stand. Though I will say that in general, this episode does look really good. It's just this damn small mouth shit that I don't like. Also, I'm really starting to grow tired of the constant use of the same dynamic between these three, at least when it's almost back to back to back like this. Like, we can have other kinds of dynamics between these three characters, you know? It doesn't have to be SpongeBob and Patrick randomly and bizarrely screwing up whatever it is Squidward is trying to do. Though, I guess to this episode's credit, here the dynamic is a little different since Squidward is for sure in the wrong for lying and assuming Squilliam's identity, so there's almost a reason to root against him. But again, I see no use for Patrick here. I don't know what's going on with Patrick randomly being in these episodes that he has no business being in. Well, I have theories, but it's growing tiring. This episode could have had SpongeBob on his own and nothing would have changed, not even the humor, though that would have led to this episode catching more accusations of being a ripoff than it already does. At least the banter between SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward in this scene is actually entertaining to me, or, well, entertaining after Squidward tells them to refer to him as Squilliam. I like how they're talking about New Year's resolutions in this part too. Like, I don't know, it just feels very common and casual and small talk like, which adds to this show. Y'all know I love those moments where it just feels like a happy and warm and wholesome sitcom kind of thing. This episode also leans into the adult side of the line, since SpongeBob and Patrick give adult learners much more than college students or younger, so that's nice. Moving on, we get what is probably the least funny version of the repetitive interruption type of joke that I've seen in this show so far. When I say repetitive interruption type of joke, think of Squidward introducing Pearl in Culture Shock, or the Sheldon thing in Plankton's Army. So yeah, SpongeBob's laugh isn't necessarily annoying here. I think I've built a pretty high tolerance to his laugh, like it rarely irritates me, but it also isn't exactly engendering feelings of amusement. And then when Squidward confronts SpongeBob and Patrick, the scene feels so goddamn slow, especially with Patrick's delivery of "he's making that up, it was him." That was just so weirdly done. And then the reveal that SpongeBob was tickling himself after all is nowhere near as funny or amusing as it was trying to be, and it makes the whole scene feel pointless since the payoff wasn't even good. Fortunately, my feelings on this scene improve exponentially when, after Squidward puts the whole class in a line, Patrick ends up tickling SpongeBob. That was funny. Too bad this doesn't last, because we then get yet another slow-going scene now between Patrick and Squidward. I can tell that Professor Squidward was going for more of a light plot that is heavy on the gags, but the problem here is that the gags aren't very good, and nearly all the scenes in the bulk of this episode feel slow and empty. Like, the witty humor actually is there for the most part, as we saw in the beginning interaction between Squidward, Patrick, and SpongeBob, but the rest of the humor this episode employs just doesn't quite work. Like, visual gags? Nah. Reactions? Nope. Slapstick? Professor Squidward doesn't even try, which is fine with me, but that does end up being another kind of humor that isn't present. And the witty humor in this episode only comes around every once in a while, and all the other attempts at jokes just don't work, so we're left with a product that isn't very funny at all. And then we get this metronome bit, and it is just boring. I at least like how absurd it is. I do love me some absurdity. When Squidward ends up being exposed as a liar, this is very anticlimactic. SpongeBob and Patrick end up exposing his ass through their apology, which to me is ridiculous because they had clearly understood that they should call Squidward Squilliam. Either the episode should have made it clear that they were doing this on purpose for whatever reason, even if it is just a troll Squidward, which would have actually been funny, or the reveal should have been much more chaotic and interesting. And we do eventually get those elements of interest and chaos once the police burst into the room to arrest Squidward. But even then, that's not enough to save this. And then the episode ends with SpongeBob and Patrick placing themselves back under the trance of the metronome, which would have been better to me had the metronome joke happened earlier in the episode, not like a minute before this. Callbacks work better the further they are from the original instance, in my opinion, and this is up to a point, of course. It's just a kind of calculus that this episode clearly does not master. Professor Squidward starts off well, but it falls off pretty quickly, which is rather disappointing. It's always rough to see an episode begin with so much potential that is then squandered. But seriously, this episode is just so freaking boring, man. This is definitely a trend I've been seeing in these season 6 episodes, with so many episodes just wasting time and not being funny. And I don't even know why or what the hell is going on. It's also just weird, because for so many of these episodes, I can't really put them any lower than okay tier, because even though they bore me, they don't really irritate me or anything, so there's no reason to put them in mediocre or below. But anyway, I think for Professor Squidward, the big issue is that I'm sitting here just waiting for it to actually start. All of the scenes in this episode just feel like setups or the beginnings of something, not entire scenes or jokes on their own. So I just leave this episode feeling unsatisfied. I also didn't like that the only characters to do anything in this episode are the Conch Street Trio. What was the point in having these background characters if they weren't going to add to the comedy anyway? Like in a regular boating school episode, you'd expect to hear at least a quip from the other students. We did at least have Billy in this episode, so there was an attempt to utilize the background characters, but unfortunately that one attempt was still very boring. Thinking of it all together, I find that Professor Squidward works best in my mediocre tier, where it comes in with a score of 5.8 out of 10. As always, I'll be ending this video with some closing thoughts of mine. Man, y'all know I don't like when reviews are so terribly unbalanced, but even with the written reviews, I always had so much more written for Professor Squidward than Shuffleboarding. In theory, I could have always padded out Shuffleboarding, but I don't like padding my reviews. I say what I want to say, no matter how long or short that is. I just happen to be someone who yaps and has a lot of random thoughts, so my reviews tend to be pretty long. Maybe not the longest review ever, but I'd say I'm pretty consistent about my reviews all being at least 5 paragraphs of written text. That's pretty detailed for a review about a cartoon with 11-minute episodes, I think. I guess my only concern is that I can be repetitive, but, well, there's only so many ways you could say similar things about episodes of similar quality, so I'm not really pressed about that. I kind of wish Squilliam played a larger role in Professor Squidward. Maybe it's because I know that our time with him is coming to an end so soon. Next season, I'm pretty sure, because they've just stopped using him, which I find to be hilarious just because of how pressed some people are about that choice. And I'll probably spend a lot more time speculating later about why they've stopped using him, so I'll put a pin in that discussion now before I start really getting into that. I think that's all I can discuss here today, which means I'll go ahead and close things out now, and I'll see y'all in the next review.